Chapter 1. And so it begins. The killer was long gone, but the violence lingered, casting a pall over the house. Her body lay broken in the sitting room. Its awkward position, on her knees, arms to her side, face to the ground, seemed staged, an unnatural end to an unspeakable act. She was cold to the touch. Blood pooled thick and glutinous around her head, matting her hair. Tiny flecks of gore speckled the walls and floor, cast off from the blunt instrument used to obliterate any semblance of her once winsome face. She was half-dressed, her underclothes an assault on Victorian modesty. A man's coat had been draped over her in a last desperate measure of dignity. Her body, like the house that enshrouded her, bore signs of the fatal struggle. Her limbs were bruised and bloodied. The carpet was torn, chairs overturned. Upstairs, her bed was in disarray, as if she had been pulled from its safe, warm confines. A framed sampler mounted on the wall above her head listed at a precarious angle. A cruel cosmic joke, its embroidered message read "Do right and fear not." It was not the only jarringly inappropriate artifact in the room. A container of homemade preserves lay half-eaten beside her, a spoon still cradled inside. The bloody fingerprints on the handle beckoned a sickening thought: her assailant had paused to eat the jam after killing her. Her cause of death was painfully obvious. A short cut of stove wood rested on the rug, painted with her blood. Its dimensions perfectly mirrored those of the jagged wounds across her face, but the log was not what killed her. 3 deep gashes across her throat were the fatal injuries, stigmata of her killer's uncontrollable rage. 2 silver-case knives lay near her head. Lest anyone doubt their significance, they were coated in blood. One, however, did not look sharp enough to cut butter. The far more formidable blade of a well-honed butcher's knife lay in wait on the only standing table in the room, yet it bore no trace of her blood. It was a curious anomaly, one that escaped all notice. Like a shadow box, her blood had captured the outline of her killer. Bloody handprints were plastered on the cutlery and the window ledge. Bloody footprints faded in the snow, flagging his escape route through the back door. The assault had been quick, but he had not been careful. He made no effort to mask his crime or destroy the telltale traces of it. There was little question her assailant had left soaked in her blood, a marked man. Her name was Annie Kempton. She was 14 years old, just 2 weeks shy of her 15th year. She had spent the evening alone in her family home. It was her first and only night of independence. She had not lived to see the dawn. In her short life, Annie had known her fair share of heartaches. As she entered her teens, Annie took her maiden voyage to the United States under less than ideal circumstances. Her cleft palate resulted in a noticeable speech impediment, and to ease the social stigma such afflictions carried, her parents had sent her south in search of a corrective operation. The procedure was not successful. Once puberty had had its way with her, Annie was left with a pretty face but was cursed with a large awkward frame and an incorrigible lisp. As if that were not a sufficient cross to bear, Annie had already fallen victim to crime, although mercifully not of the violent sort. Some months prior, a small cache of money she had saved working odd jobs was stolen. The thief was quickly apprehended and sentenced to 2 years in jail. For those possessed of a prescient mind, the incident struck a toxin note in her otherwise sheltered existence. The Kemptons lived in a sturdy if modest frame house in a village full of the same, Bear River, Nova Scotia. History records that, although socially not occupying an exalted position, the family was generally respected for their clean name and industry. Clean and industrious to a fault, the Kemptons found themselves scattered far and wide in the dawning days of 1896. Annie's father and brother spent weeks at a stretch in the surrounding forests, cutting lumber. Her mother and 3 sisters had all fled south, across the border to the Boston area, a consequence of marriage for Annie's siblings, a matter of financial necessity for the family matriarch. In absentia, parents and siblings alike agreed that Annie was too young, too naive, to be left home alone. There were plans in place, arrangements made with several local women to stay with the teen and fill the parental void. Even the best-laid plans sometimes go awry. Whether Annie found herself alone that night by choice, by accident, or by malicious design would be a question much debated in the press, in the meeting houses and local taverns, and at no less than 4 public inquiries over the next 6 months. By then, everyone felt certain they knew the answer, knew who was to blame. That's the problem with rumor masquerading as certainty. The facts seem more absolute than they actually are. Annie had been alone that night, Monday, January 27, 1896, but she was not alone the next morning. Her body was discovered by a neighbor, a young man by the name of Peter Wheeler. Peter's landlady, Tilly Comeau, had sent him to the Kempton house to buy milk. On a frigid Pewter Maritime morning, just after 8, Peter had walked into the Kempton home, calling a greeting to announce his arrival. As he made his way from the kitchen to the parlor, searching for the youngest lady of the house, he saw Annie crumpled and exposed on the sitting room floor. What happened next came under harsh scrutiny, repeatedly called into question by those fostering their own agendas. At some point, all could at least agree that Wheeler ran and raised the alarm in the village. Within seconds, the room began to fill with onlookers, doctors, police, neighbors, and friends, the concerned, the curious, and the morbid alike. Many people saw Annie as she lay on the floor, broken and lifeless. Far too many trampled through the crime scene, touching things, moving things, trying to help. Some in the village took it upon themselves to play detective, collecting evidence and documenting what they saw as material to the case. Others simply pointed fingers and demanded instant justice. Word of the murder spread quickly. Urgent cryptic messages were sent, pleading for the hasty return of the girl's parents and siblings. A call went out to Halifax requesting the assistance of a seasoned detective to head the investigation. A coroner was named and an autopsy arranged. The local funeral home was put on notice. Those without a defined role did the one thing they could: they disseminated the tragic news. Neighbor told neighbor. Distant relatives were contacted. And, in the midst of it all, a lone reporter began taking notes. In the coming days, the number of journalists jockeying for position would grow exponentially, like parasites on an accommodating host. The headlines they generated repulsed and captivated an audience hungry for every repugnant morsel. The melodrama they choreographed became a guilty pleasure for those blessed by distance. For those who knew and loved Annie, the glare of the media spotlight cauterized the still gaping wound, dulling their pain. Annie Kempton was no longer alone. Her tantalizing glimpse of privacy was gone, snuffed out by a momentary flash of violence and the opportunistic scavenging of a press corps drawn by the chum of senseless tragedy. Her life had been cloistered, bucolic, and unremarkable. Her death now belonged to the masses,